It's unnerving, isn't it? The darkness. But the darkness is where we begin. You see, you don't have to go back that far, just a couple hundred years ago, before electricity, before even gas lamps. Imagine sitting around a fire, and that's the only light you had in the darkness of the night. And then you had to make your way back to whatever you called your abode. And if you were lucky, maybe you had a stick or a torch. But how much could you really see in front of you with just a stick of fire? Just 10 feet, maybe? Or to the sides of you? Or behind you? What could be lurking in that darkness to get you? What could be out there you didn't know? So, this is the time of year where the darkness begins to reign. The days get shorter and shorter. And if you're in a northern climate, well, like where Halloween originates, Ireland, from the beginning of the month of October to the end of the month of October, well, there's an hour less daylight. So it's a dramatic shift. And along with the coming darkness, death creeps into the world. The leaves fall from the trees. The crops rot in the fields. And so it is with that, we have to think of the coming darkness. The long nights are coming, and who knows what those long nights are going to bring with it. Hi, I'm John Peter Trask. I'm a course director for historical archetypes and mythology. And we teach myths from all over the world. We have a lot of fun with that, from everything from the stuff that you'd think would be standard, like the Greeks and the Norse, to, well, especially the Celts will be rather appropriate today. But whenever there's a holiday, whenever there's a festival or something special like, Christmas or Easter or Valentine's Day, well, we like to look into the mythic origins of that. The holidays that predate the holidays we're all familiar with. And of course, well, Halloween is just around the corner. So it seems appropriate to examine some of these elements of Halloween and how it came to be. Halloween is kind of an interesting holiday because where with certain other holidays, it's pretty easy to see the direct correlation between the celebrations of the past to the celebrations of the present. It's harder to see that with Halloween. Halloween is a mishmash of a whole bunch of different things. So when we think of Halloween, we think of pretty much these four things: costumes, scary stories, candy, and fun. We spend a lot of money on it, over $9 billion a year as Americans. We spend $87 per person just about, $2.6 billion on candy, $2.7 billion on decor to make our houses spooky, $3.2 billion on costumes, and, well, at least $75 for movies for my all-month-long horror marathon. At least that's my personal budget of that. But kind of the question ends up being why? What's the reason? What's the origin? Why is this day so meaningful? Well, Halloween is a blend of a bunch of different traditions and holidays. It's a pagan New Year. It's a Christian holy day. It's a harvest festival. It's a night of romance and mystery. That one, not so much anymore, but in the past, it was a big part of Halloween. Halloween has evolved more than any other holiday. As I said before, if you start researching Christmas or Valentine's Day, well, the days are, have changed over the years, but Halloween has changed the most significantly over the centuries. And what complicates researching Halloween is there's just a bunch of misinformation out there. First and foremost, a guy named Charles Valency, an Englishman who went to Ireland in the 1700s, a historian, sort of, who recorded a whole bunch of Irish myths and legends and practices of the Celts, but they weren't interesting enough. So he turned them into barbarians and had them committing sacrifices and said that Samhain was the god of the dead. But there is no god Samhain in Irish mythology. So he was highly inaccurate. Another publication that comes out in the 1950s called Halloween Through 20 Centuries. Well, this was clearly a tome that was designed to push people away from celebrating Halloween. It was where the idea that Halloween is the devil's birthday was first written down. So once again, a lot of misinformation. But the problem with both of these texts is that despite being widely discredited, they made it into every library there was. So completely adopted, widely referenced. And so our information on Halloween, well, you got to dig deeper than the surface references. Some undisputed facts about Halloween. Halloween has a history of both pagan and Christian influence. Halloween is linked to the harvest due to its time in the year. Halloween is tied to celebrations of the dead, and so it has a morbid element about it. And Halloween has almost always been associated with parties and mischief making. The last item, the earliest influences of Halloween come from the Celtic holiday, Samhain. So if you look at the word down here, it looks like Samhain, but Gaelic is not English, and the pronunciations are very different. So it's pronounced Samhain. So let's talk a little bit about the Celts who sort of lay the groundwork for our modern Halloween. First of all, when we think of the Celts, we think of the British Isles. But this whole territory is Celtic territory prior to the expanse of the Roman Empire. The Romans and the Celts, well, they fight a lot, and, well, eventually the Celts are pushed up into the British Isles. They're a polytheistic group. They worship many, many gods, but not just polytheistic, but animistic. They kept no written records of their gods. Most of the written records we have come from Christian monks in Ireland recording their stories. They had animistic beliefs, though. So they believed that within nature, all the gods were present. They didn't build temples. They'd worship in groves and in fields and at river crossings. That's where they would worship. So nature was their temple. What's really significant that starts to indicate why this time of year would have been especially important to the Celts is how they marked their days and how they marked their calendar. So the Celts looked at the new day starting when the sun set. We put the new day some smack dab in the middle of the night somewhere. But for the Celts, it was when the sun set, the new day began. And how they marked the seasons, they marked them on cross-quarter days, which we see the names up here in this picture. Obviously, the one we're looking at is Samhain. Right up in the left corner. I had to look for it for a second. Samhain is a cross-quarter day. And what that means is it's smack dab in the middle of the fall equinox and the winter solstice. And so for the Celts, it kind of makes sense when you see how they mark their time, their shift in the time of day, or shift to the new day, and then when you look at their calendar, it makes sense that this is a New Year's celebration for them. It's the coming of the nighttime portion of the year where the darkness is going to override the light. So they're looking at this as the beginning of a new year. And so Samhain is placed on this day, and it is one of their two most important holidays, the other being Beltane in May. So some practices of Samhain for the Celts. It's a 3-day festival starting on October 31st at sunset. It marks the beginning of winter. It also marks the end of the war and trade season. And so part of this involves bringing the cattle in from the pasture and slaughtering the ones that will be too sick to survive the winter, and a harvest. So there's an abundance of food, and whenever you have an abundance of food, especially in the ancient world, well, you're going to have a big gathering, a big party. So this is where the warriors, they come back home after having war all summer long, and the people, the herders out in the fields, tending to their sheep and their goats and things, they're bringing all those things back. And so there's a big gathering of tribes and clans. The most important of these gatherings happens on the hill of Tara, the seat of kings, where the Irish kings were crowned. Part of this gathering involved feasting, sporting, and drinking. Lots of drinking, because historians theorize that this was kind of the one time of the year the Celts had ready access to alcohol. So it was a big celebration. There was some political elements to Samhain as well. It's a new year, so it was a time when all these great clan leaders were gathered at the hill of Tara. It would be a time to establish new rules and new laws and customs, but also a time to settle old debts. So your debts were coming due. It's the end of the year. It's time to pay your taxes. A bonfire would be made. Now, this would be done locally, but they'd usually make the bonfire on a hill up high, and they'd make it using friction, so rubbing two sticks together. All the other fires in the village, in the towns, all the other hearths would be put out. And then you would take sticks from this massive bonfire and you'd relight all your hearths. So it was a purification rite, a ritual of renewal and unity. When it comes to what they believed in terms of Samhain, what it represented, the most important aspect of this is the Celts believed that the realms of the living and the dead would begin to overlap, that there's sort of like two bubbles that get closer and closer, and then when they touch, they sort of form a Venn diagram. And it's at this moment that the dead can cross over into our world, the spirits of the dead. But not just the spirits of the dead, also the spirits of the Eshi, the fairies. So you can call them the Eshi, or you can just call them the Shi. A quick little mnemonic device to remember this is banshee. Would have been spelled more like S-I-D-H, banshee. So the fairies would cross. Now the fairies, the Celts really had a lot of fear around the fairies. They would call them the good people or the good folk because they didn't want to piss them off. So they would, treat them with a lot of respect, but they had a lot of fear about them. They were tricksters. They'd mess with you. They might even kidnap you and take you back to their realm. So during Samhain, when the fairies or the Shi would walk the earth along with the spirits of the dead, well, you'd leave little gifts out for them at your doorstep, usually milk, food, or alcohol. And so you'd just leave that at your doorstep and you'd go to bed early that night. Another reason you'd go to bed early is, well, your recently departed would want to come home for the night. And you'd want to leave them a seat at the table, and you'd want to leave them the warmth of the fire in the house. So you would go to bed early and give them the comfort of the hospitality. There are a number of significant mythic events that happen on Samhain in their mythology. Now, I'd love to sit and talk about all of these important events that happen in Celtic myth today, but I just don't have the time. So I'll just tell you one or two that are important. This one deals with the taxation. The Firbolg are these ancient people of Ireland, and the Fomorians are like these monstrous beings, and they tax the Firbolg on Samhain, 2/3 of all their grain, their milk, and their kids. They take 2/3 of their kids every Halloween or Samhain. Some of these other ones deal directly with the gods of the Celts, the Tuatha fighting the Fomorians, these two items right here. The cattle raid of Cooley features a very popular Celtic hero named Cuchulainn. But here's one that is kind of spooky that deals with Samhain directly. There's a hero named Finn MacCool. And at this hill of Tara, every year for the past 23 years, a monstrous fairy named Eileen has comes through the realm from the fairy world into our world, and he plays a magical harp that puts everyone to sleep. And then as soon as everyone's asleep, the fairy opens his mouth and burns the whole palace to the ground. Every year you'd think they'd get a different place to put this palace, but every year for 23 years. Well, finally this hero named Finn MacCool shows up, and he brings with him a magical spear.
When Eileen shows up, he uses the red-hot end of his magical spear to burn his own forehead to keep awake while the enchanting music plays. And then he deflects the flames using a magical shield or even his cloak. And when Eileen realizes he's met his match, he begins to flee back into the fairy world. So Finn throws his spear and kills the wicked fairy. An even creepier Halloween story, Angus is just going to have to go. You're going to have to look him up yourself, is the adventure of Nera. Now, in this particular tale, Nera is a soldier for a king, and he's at a fort, and the king dares all of his soldiers. I bet not one of you is brave enough on this Samhain to tie a wicker band around the corpse of a hanged man. And Nera, well, he volunteers. So he goes to the gallows, he hangs a wicker band, and the corpse comes to life and says, "Hey, man, I'm really thirsty." So Nera takes down the corpse because he's a nice guy, and he takes him to a house. But as soon as he approaches the house, it goes up in flames. And then he goes to another house, and it's flooded by water. And then he goes to a third house, and nothing strange happens. So the couple lets them in, and they give the corpse 1 cup of water, and then a second cup. And then the third cup of water, the corpse spits all over the owners of the house, and they die instantly. So Nera, not too happy that the corpse has done this, takes him back to the gallows and hangs him back up, and he goes to go back to his post, and he sees his whole fort is on fire. And all the residents of the fort have been decapitated, and their heads are placed on spikes. Well, he sees this army fleeing the fort, and he follows them to a hill, and they just disappear into the side of the hill. So he realizes it was an army of Eshi, of the fairies. So he follows them into the hill as well. And there he meets Eshi, who he falls in love with, and who tells him that everything he saw was just an illusion, that all that will come to pass on the next Samhain. So he decides he has to go tell his king what is going to happen so he can prepare. And when he leaves the land of the Sidhe, no time has passed. He's been there for months, but no time has passed. And it's Samhain, and he still has the wicker band in his hand that he was going to tie around the corpse. That's a pretty common element of these early Celtic myths, that no time passes when you enter the land of the fairies. So there's a lot of other references to Samhain, or Halloween, I should say, that we can find in other cultures. One of them is Roman culture. There is this widely inaccurately reported holiday of Pomona, which is said to be a harvest festival dedicated to the goddess Pomona that the Romans took to incorporate Samhain into their own belief system. But pretty much any historian worth his salt knows that the Romans didn't have a festival dedicated to Pomona. However, there is a different festival that happens in May called Lemuria. And Lemuria was very similar to Samhain. It was a day in which the dead would cross over into our world, but whereas the Celts kind of, left a place at the hearth for their dead, the Romans were like, "Stay away, guys." And so Lemuria featured essentially a casting out of wicked spirits, an expulsion of them. And so the tradition would be the head of the household in the middle of the night would get up, walk around the house barefoot, and throw black beans over their shoulder, reciting this incantation 9 times. "I send these. With these beans I redeem me and mine." And the other members of the family would bang pots and pans and say, "Ghosts of my fathers and ancestors, be gone." And that was supposed to cast them out. Well, this little holiday doesn't really have anything to do with Samhain other than some vague similarities. But what begins to tie them together is when the Catholic Church takes over Rome, they place the original All Saints' Day on May 13th. Pope Boniface declares it a day to celebrate Mary and all the saints and martyrs. So what happens is, just a little over 100 years later, All Saints' Day gets moved to November 1st by Pope Gregory III. And this, anytime this happens, there's always a couple dissenting historians that say, well, the real reason they moved it was because of the harvest, and there were a bunch of pilgrims coming to Rome. And they kind of do that in spite of the more obvious reason of, well, the Irish Celts refused to celebrate All Saints' Day on November 1st. So they are co-opting Samhain. They're trying to get these people, these pagans, more converted into Catholicism. So to really get the Irish Celts to celebrate it, they add a second day, All Souls' Day. It gets added in 1000 in France. It becomes a day for praying for all the souls trapped in purgatory. By the 1400s, All Souls' Day is on every liturgical calendar, and it's widely adopted. And it's around this time that Halloween shows up in literature, in passing texts and things like that. The word Halloween starts showing up. So, for example, we read in Old Times, this is from 1511, so Old Times must be, a couple hundred years before this, for the 1400s. We read in Old Times, good people would on All Hallows' Day bake bread and deal it to Christian souls, or for Christian souls. So there are some other medieval factors that really shape their practices of All Hallows' Eve and these specific days. So now we kind of have a festival week. We've got All Hallows' Eve, which envelops the practices of Samhain, All Souls' Day, or All Saints' Day, and then All Souls' Day. The Black Plague really messes up the psyche of the Europeans in the Middle Ages. People are dying by the boatloads. Just death is everywhere. And so the emaciated forms and the morbid features start showing up in the artwork. And there's this idea of the danse macabre, the idea that the dead come to life and kind of have a party. They dance around, like as you can sort of see in this picture. The already associations with the spirits, the dead, they start to incorporate into Halloween, or All Hallows' Eve. Witch hunts become really big in the Middle Ages. One of the reasons is they're looking for anybody to blame for all the death that's coming their way. So they're hunting witches. Witches are accused of holding black masses on All Hallows' Eve. Likely there's a political element to it in that when Henry VIII leaves the Church of Rome and starts his own church, he outlaws All Saints' Day. He says it's a papal holiday. And so people are still practicing the habits that they're accustomed to with All Saints' Day. And thus, it's like, well, we'll tie it to witchcraft and that sort of stuff. And thus, people will reject it a little bit more. There's a tale, actually, of the Berwick witch trials, in which King James accuses a bunch of Scots of using witchcraft to prevent him from making it to his wife in Denmark. He says that they were riding the sea in sieves and throwing body parts that were tied to live cats into the water to cause a tempest to prevent him from getting there. Another big event that happens around, well, kind of near the tail end of the Middle Ages, is the gunpowder plot of Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes, he tries to blow up Parliament and King James with it, and he is caught, and it becomes a huge celebration for the United Kingdom to celebrate the defeat of this Catholic who wanted to see the Church of England and all of its proponents destroyed. So this kind of ends up being a big celebration for the British as well. So now you've kind of expanded this week of holiday celebration. Some of the Halloween traditions that creep up near the, probably the Renaissance, the post-Renaissance, that type of period, would be bonfires. Bonfires were really important already to the Celts, but also to the British. In some ways, you were clearing out the fields of all the refuse, but it was said that bonfires would keep the fairies away. It would welcome the souls of the dead back home. So they had a lot of functions. Fortune telling was a huge part of Halloween for centuries. Oftentimes, these acts of fortune telling were used to try to figure out who you were going to marry. So there's hundreds of them. Well, maybe not hundreds, but there's a lot of them. And so I'll just mention these two. Nut burning, which you can see going on here. You'd name the nuts like after your prospective lovers, and you'd throw them into the fire, and the one that burned the brightest would be the one that you were destined to be with. And luggy bowls were a popular custom, where luggy bowl is a bowl with a handle. And so you'd fill them with, well, one would be filled with clear water, one with dirty water, and one that was empty. You'd blindfold the person, you'd mix the bowls up, and the first bowl they touched would foretell their future mate and their purity level. So if you touched the clean water, well, you're going to marry a virgin. If you touched the dirty water, you weren't going to marry a virgin. And if you touched the empty bowl, well, get your spinster clothes ready because you're not going to get married. So, those are the luggy bowls. Apple games are also very popular due to the abundance of apples during this time of year. So everyone knows bobbing for apples, but I think my favorite one is depicted right here called Snap Apple, where they'd put an apple at the end of a stick and then put a candle on the other end and then spin that sucker around, and you were supposed to catch the apple and not get burned by the hot wax of the candle. What a great game. Let's play that with all our kids this year. It's just super good game for the kids. Door-to-door begging was already a part of Halloween around this time of year. Usually with this, it was begging for fuel for the bonfires or money for a feast in a saint's name. But the most popular aspect of this door-to-door begging was known as soul caking. And a soul cake is just a simple little cake that's made and marked with a cross, for the Christian souls. And so the kids would go around, usually smearing their face with like ash or something like that to look really poor and destitute. And they would stop and knock on everyone's door and say, a soul cake. And they would get this little cake, and they would get the cake in exchange for praying for the souls of the person who gave the cake and their loved ones that may have passed on. The jack-o'-lantern also finds its origin in Ireland, probably. This is a pretty creepy-looking jack-o'-lantern. This is actually a medieval jack-o'-lantern. They didn't have pumpkins, so they used turnips. And the idea was very similar to the bonfire, that it was kind of taking that little piece of the bonfire with you. You'd carve a little lantern out of a turnip, you put that little hot coals from the bonfire in the turnip, and then you'd have a little piece of that safe bonfire as you walked home that would help protect against the fairies. It would help protect against malevolent spirits, and would also kind of guide spirits home. The story of where the name jack-o'-lantern comes from a little folk tale. Where is he? Called Stingy Jack. And Stingy Jack, he was a jerk. So he was really stingy. And there's a couple of variants of the tale, but they all involve him trapping the devil with a cross. One good example is he tricks the devil into climbing an apple tree, and he carves a cross in the tree, and now the devil's trapped. And so as a deal to let the devil go, he makes the devil promise not to take his soul when he dies. Well, eventually he does die, and he was such a jerk that he can't get into heaven, and the devil appears before him and says, well, I can't take you because I made my promise, so I guess you're just going to wander the earth. And he goes, well, what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? And the devil says, I don't know, and he tosses him a hot coal, so Jack carves a turnip into a jack-o'-lantern, and jack-o'-lantern is short for Jack of the Lanterns. So he's walking around with his lantern, and that's where the name comes from. So Halloween makes it to America in the 1800s. The first real literary reference we have to anything sort of Halloween-ish in American history is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving in 1820. However, Halloween isn't mentioned, but those Halloween elements of the Harvest Festival, the pumpkin, the ghost stories, those are all there with this. The Irish potato famine brings a lot of immigrants to America, and they start bringing their traditions with them, of course. The Industrial Revolution also plays a part in forming American habits concerning Halloween, and one of the things that this does is it causes a rise in the middle class. And so the middle class start reading elements of how the British aristocracy celebrate Halloween, and they want to kind of emulate that. And so guides start appearing for how to throw a Halloween party, but mostly they're presented as children's parties. So the guide that shows up that's indicated here, this probably isn't the guide that has this element in it, but it's called Goody's Ladies Book and Magazine. And so it outlines a basic Halloween party in the form of a narrative. Guides to throwing these Halloween parties and Other Halloween-like events grow in popularity throughout the 1800s. A lot of them include the idea of costuming for the party. In 1910, or in the 19-teens, if you will, the colors black and orange are set for the Halloween colors. They're representing the darkness of the night and the orange of the pumpkin that becomes far more widely available and easier to carve for the purpose of jack-o'-lanterns. A problem arises with Halloween in the 19-teens as pranking begins to grow in popularity with adolescents. Now, the Irish would prank during Samhain. The idea was that the fairies were causing mischief, but it was probably just, teenagers with nothing better to do. And so the tradition kind of continues on here in America. The pranking starts off kind of innocent. What these kids are doing is they're stealing a gate. They take the gate off of somebody's hinges and maybe take it to Main Street and throw it in a pile of a whole bunch of other gates. And so they're just kind of a pain in the ass. They're just making these, they're throwing a sock full of flour at a guy in a black coat. It's more obnoxious than it is terrible. But the problem is the pranking gets completely out of hand. By the 1920s, it gets worse, and by the 30s, it's so bad that something has to be done about it. What they're doing now is they're like setting fires, smashing windows. They are, in one instance, they're cutting down telephone poles. Like, this is going way beyond pranking at this point. This picture right here is something called a tic-tac. That was a very popular pranking device. You take a wooden spool and you cut some notches in it. You put it on a dowel and you hold it against a window. There'd be a rope around the spool, and you'd pull it and just go brrrap against the window and scare the hell out of the people inside. So all this pranking is completely out of hand, and the communities begin to rally around finding solutions to this problem. So groups like the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, schools, and groups of parents start getting together to come up with activities for these ne'er-do-wells to do during Halloween, as opposed to vandalizing the city. So more and more guidebooks start getting published. Halloween becomes a true cultural event within, but then the Great Depression hits. Some of the activities they would do would include pageants and parades and various other activities. But when the Great Depression hits, well, the communities don't really have the money for this kind of thing. So they have to find other ways to take care of the problem. And what they discover, or what they arrive at, I should say, is this idea of a house-to-house party. Money was tight. People were poor. So what they do is they'd host one activity at a house in the neighborhood, and then the neighborhood host another activity, and the other neighborhood host another. And the kids would start at one house and kind of go to each house. And it's pretty easy to see how this leads to the modern idea of trick-or-treating. So it's very easy to tie the idea of trick-or-treating to soul caking, or the kids in the Middle Ages going around begging for money or bonfire fuel or something like that. But the trick-or-treating itself, it's kind of funny. Thanksgiving was actually more associated with door-to-door begging in the 1800s than any other holiday. So there might be other holidays that tie into this development of trick-or-treating. But it becomes very popular in the 30s, and it takes off completely in the 1950s after World War II is done, and the rationing of all these sugar and other items has ended. Now, Halloween trick-or-treating becomes just the thing to do. At this point, Halloween is almost exclusively for kids. It's pretty much just a kids' holiday. So, as I said, it's easy to tie the idea of trick-or-treating to soul caking or other Celtic activities. It's heavily reported that the Celts wore costumes to scare away the Eshi, but there's no historical evidence of it. The only historical evidence of them doing anything to change their appearance was flipping their clothes inside out. However, this practice of mumming becomes very popular in the 1500s. And basically what mumming is you go from house to house in costume, putting on a show in exchange, or singing a song in exchange for some kind of food, alcohol, or maybe money. So this became a part of the Halloween celebrations in the Middle Ages. And so you can see some ties to this and the costuming and the door-to-door begging. The concept, not the belief, that the ancient Celts wore costumes to scare away the fairies develops around the same time period. This is where you first start seeing mentions of it in historical literature. Masquerade balls were also a big part of the Middle Ages, kind of having fun, dressing up in costume, dancing around. The first report of costuming and Halloween sort of trick-or-treating type behavior happens in Ontario in 1911. A paper cites kids guising, going from door to door in costumes. Disguises were also used to make mischief, so they were kind of adding to the problem. You know, you conceal your face while you're cutting down that telephone pole. You don't want to get caught, so you hide who you are. The costumes then started to blend into the new Halloween custom of trick-or-treating. So when we think about wearing costumes, one of the things that I find really interesting is like, why is it so fun? What's so special about it? I love dressing up for Halloween, and what's the thrill of it? Well, for kids, it's a night that's in some ways even more magical than Christmas, if you think about it. It's a night where not only do they get to pretend to be somebody else, but they can be loud, noisy, be rude, and like out of control, and they don't even get punished for it. In fact, they get rewarded for this behavior. So it's a pretty awesome night for kids. Things that start influencing the costumes is there's an influx of horror movies and comics in the 1930s and 40s that start to really make an impression. So people start dressing up as the monsters from these various movies and inspirations in comics. In the 1930s, the mass-produced costumes start coming into play. So it's easy enough to start going to the store. But of course, the 1930s also has the Great Depression, so not so many people can afford it. In fact, I was talking to my mother, who was the third child of 7 kids, and she said like they never had store-bought costumes, and she was trick-or-treating in the 1950s. And I said, well, what did you guys dress as? And she pointed out, like, you know, ghosts with the sheets, monsters, witches. She said hobos, like bums were kind of scary. You know, it was a scary thing, and it was easy to do. Cowboys, devils, gypsies, things like that, just these sort of homemade costumes. The children of the 50s eventually grow up, they become adults, and they have very fond memories of going trick-or-treating. And so not only do they want their kids to go trick-or-treating, but man, they enjoy dressing up in the costume as well. So we start to see Halloween inching back into the realm of the adults as well as kids. Popular franchising in the 70s and 80s turned costume licensing into really big business for people. I remember these vacuum form masks very distinctly, and the awful plastic outfits that you would wear with them. If, you know, anything, no matter what it was, if it was even remotely popular, you could get one of these costumes for a couple of bucks at the local, you know, department store. And it'd be things like He-Man, you can see Garfield, Snoopy, Star Wars, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Barbie, whatever it was. If it was popular, you could find one of these outfits for it. It was in the 1980s at the Halloween store that we're very familiar with, things like Spirit or, you know, Halloween City or whatever they might be called, started to rise up in the 1980s because, quite simply, you know, these were okay when you were a little kid, but, you know, as you can see, they're pretty awful. So people wanted better costumes, and so this became a nice place to go to start getting higher quality costumes. And this brings us back to the thrill of becoming someone else, but this time for adults. And the way I look at it is Halloween is the one night as adults that we get to be somebody else, sort of escape the mundane aspects of our normal life, and kind of maybe more significantly embrace some of the vices that we have to push away. You know, you can kind of be an asshole in a costume. You can kind of be sexually promiscuous in a costume. And so we can embrace those vices in a different way, and we can say, well, it's just a costume, I'm not really this way, but maybe it's just a little reflection of who we really are, but that we don't show to the rest of of the public on a regular basis. So there are a number of urban legends that creep up around Halloween, and this is another thing that I'd love to sit and talk a lot more about, but there's not a whole lot of time left. There's a bit of a backlash in the 1960s when it comes to Halloween and sort of kids who are maybe too old to be going trick-or-treating and things like that. And so you get the rise of these urban legends, things like razor blades and apples and needles in candy bars and poisoned candy. There's a legend, or not, it's sort of an urban legend of Satanists killing black cats around Halloween. There's a lot of animal shelters that won't adopt out cats around Halloween. However, I scoured the net for any confirmed cases of this, and guess how many I found? None. So the dead cats, it's just as easy that they got killed by a coyote as they got killed by a Satanist. So it's just because of the Halloween's association with evil and wickedness and things that people start making these assumptions. One of the more recent ones is the idea of giving drugs to kids at Halloween. In the 70s, there was a fear of LSD-laced temporary tattoos, so that when they lick the tattoo to put it on them, they'd, really start tripping. More recently, it's THC gummies, and I'd love to know who's rich enough here to buy a bunch of THC gummies and give them to kids. It's a pretty hilarious fear. You see it on the news, though, and it cracks me up every time. Even more recently, we have the killer clown scare of 2016. That started in Green Bay, Wisconsin, of all places, where it was a publicity stunt for a horror movie that was being made. This guy in a clown outfit was showing up in public spaces. But man, did people love it. So people started dressing up as clowns and being all creepy and lurking in neighborhoods and things like that. So it was a worldwide phenomena in 2016. Probably heavily fueled by It coming back to the theaters. So as far as how popular culture and Halloween have blended, there are early mentions in poetry and other literature, but I'm not going to really get into those. Robert Burns wrote a poem in 1785 called Halloween that describes all the medieval and Victorian, pre-Victorian era customs of Halloween. I've already kind of mentioned the guides to Halloween start coming out in the 1800s, and more books start referencing the day. What really kind of sets some Halloween stories, they're all recommended for school readings in the 1920s, are The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Young Goodman Brown, and The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. So with these three stories, you get these three classic Halloween images of the witch in Young Goodman Brown, the black cat in Edgar Allan Poe's tale, and the pumpkin or jack-o'-lantern in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So these become just the standard, it's autumn, let's have the kids read a spooky story. Those are the three go-to ones that start showing up in textbooks. In the 1930s, you have this rise of the universal horror monsters, some of my favorite monster movies to this day. This definitely affects the culture. They become very, very popular, but even more significantly probably is in the 1950s, they get syndicated. And so now kids can just watch them on their television, and it creates what some historians call the monster culture of the 1950s and 60s. In 1962, part of this monster culture is the song The Monster Mash, and it's probably one of two songs that we always associate with Halloween. In 1966, The Great Pumpkin comes out, and this is, as far as I know, the first official Halloween special. And basically after the success of The Great Pumpkin, every media, I'm trying to think of the word, property, every media property comes out with some sort of Halloween special, and every sitcom has a Halloween episode. It just becomes the norm. That it just becomes a part of the culture to have these Halloween specials. In 1978, Halloween, the movie, comes out, John Carpenter's Halloween. This, all this other stuff is pretty accessible to kids at this point, but this obviously shouldn't be too accessible to kids. It really brings a lot of terror back into Halloween, the fear and scary elements back into the holiday. In 1982, Thriller comes out, and in 1993, The Nightmare Before Christmas comes out, and so all of these things help add to the cultural awareness of the holiday. Now, what's really significant about the cultural awareness of the holiday is, as Americans, our biggest export is our media and our culture. And so things like Halloween, Michael Jackson's Thriller, The Nightmare Before Christmas, the Universal Monsters, they start getting exported around the world. And so what you see is other countries start adopting certain elements of Halloween. Some with some success, some with others. For example, in France, it's big for about 10 years, and now it pretty much doesn't exist. The most successful places where Halloween gets adopted are Germany, Russia, Hong Kong, and Japan. But even more interestingly, it goes back to Great Britain. This odd thing happens, even though the holiday originates in the British Isles, it starts to disappear from the public practice of it. It just sort of kind of disappears. Guy Fawkes Day becomes the big holiday around that time of year, and Halloween kind of just disappears from the public consciousness. But because it becomes such a success in America, and these movies and these other media pieces start flooding back to Great Britain, well, it's not long before the English start celebrating Halloween again. I'd love to talk about Dia de Muertos in Mexico, just don't really have the time for it, but obviously another really important celebration that deals with the dead around this time of year. And we can really kind of see that the practice of Halloween doesn't really need to fit into any kind of defined category. It's its own thing. It doesn't have to be related to Samhain. You don't have to light a bonfire and dance around it. It doesn't have to be related to trick-or-treating or costuming. It's however we want to celebrate it. The one thing that kind of unifies whatever practice of Halloween that we have is it's a time of year, once again, where the days get shorter, the nights get longer, the earth starts to wither. We start to feel the fear of the coming darkness. And of course, that also leads us to think about the inevitable coming darkness, the grim inevitable of our own mortality. So, Halloween, a night when spirits cross over into our realm, a night when we don costumes of scary, undead things, of the living dead, if you will. Well, it's a night to look our own mortality in the face and laugh at it. And that's that. Thanks. So I know this is, oh, they muted me. I don't know if we have time for questions. I know this went a little longer than I wanted it to, but I'm very long-winded, so I can't help myself. I can't see anything with these lights, so. 10 minutes? All right, sweet.
John, what is your favorite Halloween tradition?
Costuming, definitely. I do a lot of different things for Halloween. I decorate the house, but my favorite thing is costuming. I very proudly admit I've won the Full Sail Halloween contest 2 years in a row now. Going for a third this year with a group costume, so hopefully, fingers crossed.
Are you going to give us a hint as to what it is, or is it going to be a surprise?
It's kind of got to be a surprise. I think if I told you, it would spoil the surprise. So.
So, with the she,
Yes.
you said that people would lay out alcohol and stuff for them. What would happen if they didn't?
The idea is that the fairies were tricksters, so they'd mess with you. They might cause a bad harvest for you, or they might, just, it's kind of the equivalent of like hiding your keys or, misplacing things around the house, things like that. They weren't gonna like burn down your house or like kill all of your kids or something like that. It was more just like this, they just really caused mischief for you. That was pretty much what they were looking to avoid.
Oh, there you go. So would that be where the whole trick-or-treating theme comes in?
I think there's certain elements to that with the Eshi. I think the idea of leaving things out for them is, I imagine those things would be gone in the morning, and I'm reasonably certain fairies weren't crossing over into our world and taking the stuff. So I would guess that probably people were sneaking around, getting drunk on other people's booze and eating other people's food. So that's what I would assume was going on. There are sort of, once again, these come from the Middle Ages, so I don't know how trustworthy they are as sources, but there are some reports of like the Celts dressing up as the fairies going from door to door. But like I said, I don't know if I necessarily trust that because we don't really have any firsthand accounts, written accounts of that going on, so it could just be conjecture.
Could you talk a little bit more about Halloween on the global scale? I was kind of surprised you said it's kind of backtracked in France.
Yeah, the stuff I read about France was, yeah, it had risen to popularity. A lot of the French people liked the celebration, the dressing up, sort of the festival atmosphere of it. But the French are really, really protective of their own culture. They have real cultural protection laws that only allow so many American films in a year and things like that. And especially during the 2000s when we're doing like freedom fries and stuff like that, the French had an equally strong backlash against American attitudes and traditions, and that's really when Halloween kind of just, they were like, nope, we're not doing this anymore. It's an American thing, we're not gonna do it. As far as the around the world, like I said, the holiday is really popular in Germany, and it's definitely an American export that they dress up in costumes, they go trick-or-treating, very similar elements. It's also super popular in Japan where the whole idea of cosplay is really big, and so this is another day to sort of dress up as your favorite characters or kind of embrace that element of costuming and fun and things like that. I don't know if that's sufficient to answer your question.
Viewers, Troy would like to know that obviously Halloween is one of your favorite holidays. But how do you know so much? Did you take it upon yourself to study, or did you actually take classes?
There's a couple of books out there that are okay. The main one I used for this was, it's called Trick or Treat, and I don't remember what the after Trick or Treat : it is, but I can tell you the cover is like two kids in like the traditional ghost costume with the eyes cut out. It's a pretty good book. It covers a lot of this stuff. I will say, not to be overly critical, but it's kind of more like she wrote like 5 different books and kind of mushed them all together because there's a lot of repetitive elements to it. But it's where I got a lot of the information. I have another book called, man, I can't remember what it's called. Like Halloween, no, man, I can't remember what it's called. But I feel so woefully unprepared now for this question. It was okay. It wasn't as good. I look for books where I can see like the real history behind it rather than the, like if you just go to websites, all you're gonna find is like the traditional stuff, like, oh, the Celts, they dressed in costume and the this and that. So I always look for history, and then I double check all the history around it to make sure that it's that it passes the smell test. You know, that because with any holiday, whether it's Christmas or Valentine's Day, you have all these legends that creep up and come out, and people kind of take it as fact, and generally it's not fact. It's just legend. So it's just a lot of research. That's how I know more about it. And it's funny you asked about a class. In the research that I was doing, the first ever academic symposium or conference on Halloween was first held in 2006. So this is a thing that is only kind of recently really being studied by historians. So I expect that in the coming years, we're going to get some better books on Halloween and the historical significance of it.
Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, good. How are you?
You said that Halloween is basically a holiday that's celebrated around the world. It seems that the origins are based on events that happen in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yes.
Anything about, as the Europeans went to the other parts of the world, we're talking about countries like Australia, different parts of Africa. Does it have the same significance since they don't have the same types of events going on at that time of the year?
It doesn't have quite the same significance. You mentioned Australia and New Zealand. They really are into the Guy Fawkes Day because of the British influence there. There are some, there's some influences, but it hasn't really taken off so much there. Dia de Muertos obviously is pretty popular in Mexico. It starts, I don't remember what specific region in Mexico it starts in, but it has since kind of spread to the whole of the country. One of the more interesting little factoids about Dia de Muertos, first of all, it's not Dia de los Muertos. That's a reverse translation. It's like the Day of the Dead, and then it gets translated back into Spanish as Dia de los Muertos. It's Dia de Muertos. And I know that's not the Southern Hemisphere, but one of the little interesting tidbits about it is I forgot which James Bond movie it is, but they want to have a Dia de Muertos parade in Mexico City, and Mexico City's like, we don't have one of those parades. And they're like, well, you're going to have it for this James Bond movie. And so they have this parade, and then it becomes like a tradition now in Mexico City to have a parade for it. Some of those elements have spread to regions in South America, but it's not super strong down in South America. As far as Africa, I don't think there's a whole lot of influence on Halloween in Africa, but it's kind of outside the scope of my research, so I can't confirm nor deny that.
Are there other holidays you're as interested in or passionate about, or big Halloween guy mainly?
I'm a huge. I mean, Halloween is like, it's the biggest day of my year. It's my favorite day of the year. That, and then WrestleMania, and then Cinco de Mayo. But and then Christmas. But I really like researching some of those other holidays. Valentine's Day is very interesting to me. There's a lot of myths around Valentine, or legends, I should say, around Valentine's Day that just don't hold up at all, that are fascinating. How it becomes a holiday associated with love. They don't even know, like, the Pope who canonized St. Valentine doesn't even know what Valentine did to be canonized. Like, he's quoted as saying, like, his name is justly remembered, but his deeds are known only to God. So, like, even as he's being canonized, no one knows who Valentine is. That to me is fascinating. Christmas is also really interesting in terms of the holiday elements. The traditions that predate Christmas are what make a lot of our Christmas traditions the norm. And Easter is also pretty fascinating because there's a lot of misinformation out there about Easter, tying it to the goddess Ishtar, just because their names sound kind of similar. The goddess Eostra, who's the Germanic pagan goddess that brings us the hare and the egg, at least that's what they say. But that wasn't written about, that was first written about her by Jacob Grimm of Grimm's fairy tales. So, I really trust his analysis of that goddess. So there are these ties that try to tie Easter to these pagan celebrations, but like the ties are kind of desperate and tenuous at best. So I like discovering things like that and just kind of knowing it and telling other people about it. It's fun.
Hey, John,
Hey,
what's your favorite Halloween candy?
I really love Butterfinger, and if not Butterfingers, then Milky Way. I like the caramel in Milky Way a lot. It's really good. I like to kind of just eat away everything but the caramel, and then just let the caramel melt in my mouth. It's delicious. It's my favorite. It's my favorite. It's probably way more information than you wanted.
So is this more fun for you or for your kids?
My kids love it too. In some ways, it's not. It's fun, but it's. I put so much stress on myself for it that it kind of becomes not fun. I try to watch at least one horror movie every day during the month, and then that starts cutting into like time that I need to do other stuff. I was trying to like prepare for this, decorate the house, and watch horror movies yesterday, and it's just like, it's stressful. But the kids, my kids, they love it. They have a lot of fun.
Is the class different this month? Based around Halloween?
No. The class is different this month because I rearranged a bunch of stuff, but it's not different because of Halloween.
For one more question right here.
All right, so with the movie Trick or Treat,
Yeah.
do you think that they did research, the same kind of research that you did?
And it's been a couple years since I've seen Trick or Treat, but I think it's a nice anthology movie as far as like I know little Sam is running around. Obviously, it's a mispronunciation and all that, but I don't know. It's pretty fun. As far as like the accuracy of it, obviously, it's just a anthology horror movie, so I don't know. I can't really speak to that, but and it's, like I said, it's been a couple years since I've seen it, so I kind of need a refresher. But it's fun. It's a fun movie. I don't know. Well, do you have any more specific examples that I can speak to?
So with the scene where the kids are taking the girl who didn't know what she was going down to the bus that fell off the bridge, they used jack-o'-lanterns to ward off the evil spirits.
Ah, yes.
Also the candy, with the principal poisoning the kid. And then at the end with the werewolf girls dancing around the bonfire.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks you for the specific reminders. I kind of forgot about the kids in the school bus element to that. There's a lot of stuff there that does seem like they did a pretty good amount of research. You have the werewolves are different from witches, but the idea that the witches would dance around a bonfire on Halloween during a Black Sabbath or something like that. Werewolf or lycanthropy has a medieval tie to the devil as well. So the idea that then they would turn into werewolves, that seems to hold up to me. The element of the school bus and then the spirits coming back on Halloween. Of course, it's the night when the two realms overlap. And once again, the jack-o'-lanterns to ward them off. All those things definitely fit with the themes of Halloween, and not just the modern themes, but the more ancient themes as well. I don't know what that sign means. Well, this is it. All right. Thanks everyone for coming, and appreciate it.